Welcome back to the Lens Dose Photography Podcast. I'm your host, Oliver Winegar. In this episode, we will be talking with Andy Metcalf about whether gear actually matters. Let's roll some intro music. So, Andy, yes or no? Does gear actually matter?
Oh, that's a hilarious and loaded question. Yes and no.
What? You have to pick one or the other. You can't. Where do you lean more towards, yes or no?
I lean towards yes, gear can matter. I'm going to mess with your sentence no matter, your question no matter what. Yes, it can matter is what I am going to have to stick to. But there are so many different factors that play into that. There's not really a solid way to answer that question. There's way too many factors that go into that, and I guess that's what we're here to talk about,
to discuss. Yeah, my first instinct to that answer is no, gear does not matter. Even though I love gear, I know truly that it doesn't. But does it though? Because it kind of does. And so that's kind of what we want to talk about this episode 2 of the Lens Dose Photography Podcast, is whether gear actually matters or not. Andy, what can expensive cameras and lenses do that cheaper ones can't?
So many things. I kind of feel like, basic / entry level cameras under ideal circumstances can produce excellent results. But as soon as you step away from that ideal scenario, that's where more expensive cameras and more expensive lenses allow you to create the things that you want to create, because they can better handle those scenarios, those situations. And then there's things that you just can't do with your basic camera with the kit lens, that they're just not capable of.
Let's start with an example though. Since I love landscape photography so much, what can a nicer camera do, a pro camera do, that a cheaper one can't? Let's say maybe not an entry-level Canon Rebel T6 or something like that, but a T6i or something like that, or a 70D. What can that do that a 5D Mark IV or a EOS R5 can't landscape-wise? How is that going to matter? If you're just viewing it on your phone and stuff like that, not printing or anything, what's going to be the actual difference?
Well, the difference between those two cameras, the first thing that pops into my head when it comes to landscape photography is dynamic range. The Canon's professional level full frame camera is going to have better dynamic range and give you more detail in the shadows and more detail in the light areas, in the whites, in the sky, that your basic Rebel, even your step up like the T7i or the T8i, just doesn't have the capability to do, because it's just not built into the camera.
Yeah, but at the same time, you could just do a multiple exposure on your crop sensor, and then that could be equivalent.
Certainly, you can take 3 or 4 pictures with different exposures, and then sit down in Photoshop and merge them all together and hope they line up right, all of those things, and potentially get those same results. Or with the pro camera, you can take that picture and have those results.
Yeah, I think that's for sure true. And I think one thing too that's made probably the biggest difference, maybe compared to shooting on a Rebel compared to an EOS R5 or a 5D Mark IV, is just usability. Now, especially when we were working at Allen's together, and I would mess around with a customer's camera using a Rebel or whatever, they're just difficult to use. They don't have many buttons. They're user friendly, but you're just super limited. And so you can really tell that these beginner cameras are meant for using auto settings or something like that, and not really using manual as much. You can use manual. It just,
for sure,
it's more of a pain.
Yeah, well, and I had a similar experience just this week. I was testing out a couple of different lenses. One of them, a Tamron lens that's newer, same focal length as an older Canon L series.
And what lenses were they that you were testing out?
They were the 100 to 400
Okay.
millimeter lenses, and they got some great results. But one of them I had mounted to my Canon R5. The other one was mounted to the Canon RP, which is the entry level full frame mirrorless camera. Is it a capable camera? Absolutely. Was it frustrating as crud for me to try and use when I'm used to my R5 and what my R5 will do? Absolutely. It was difficult to deal with and frustrating to try and get to the settings and the things that I wanted to do. And then there were things that I thought I could do with the RP that I couldn't do because it's just not there. And there's certainly some bias with having and owning and utilizing high-end cameras and then trying to use the cheaper stuff, with a lack of a better word, is it's harder for me to use than someone else who has upgraded to the RP and has never played with or utilized an R5 with all of the things that it's capable of doing.
But for generic use, though, wouldn't you say that these cheaper cameras, they can do everything the nicer ones can, maybe just not as well, though? At least now everything that comes out, because almost everything that comes out now takes at least 20 megapixel photos, which is really good, and does 4K video. So generally speaking, they can do everything the professional cameras can, maybe just not as well.
Yeah, generally speaking, for sure. And that's where that, what I was speaking of earlier, is when you diverge from that ideal scenario, it can become much more difficult to try and achieve the same results with the less expensive camera than with the more expensive camera. The easy example is with your ISO capabilities. The R5's ISO capabilities are crazy nice, and I can shoot 20 or 30 minutes longer in the day with that camera than I could with, say, a Rebel, because I can crank the ISO up to 30,000 and still have usefulness, where the Rebel just isn't capable of that at all. It doesn't even go that high.
Yeah. So do you think, if for the most part then, that you can't get the same results with a cheaper camera than you can with a nicer one? And this, before you answer that, this leads me to a video that I saw today. Who was it from? Darren Spoonley. They have a podcast too, the Irish Photography Podcast, which is a really, really great one. But the YouTube video I saw and that I sent to you earlier today,
I watched.
It was the EOS R with the 16 to 35 f4 adapted to it versus the EOS R5 with the 15 to 35 f2.8. And it was comparing kind of a bunch of images, almost the exact same image, just shot with the different setup. And every time I looked at it, I could not tell the difference. And I guess it pops up for a few seconds and then it's gone. But every time I looked at the comparison, I guessed one, and half the time I was right. I could not tell for the life of me, but let's hear what you have to say about that, Andy.
So I watched the video. I looked at the comparison photos, and it give you an opportunity to guess which is which. I only got it right 100% of the time.
Were you watching this on your phone?
I was, yeah.
Which is, I don't understand how you could tell from that small of a screen.
Well,
and this is the thing. With me, who's a pretty avid photographer, couldn't tell. Do you think most other people would be able to tell?
I don't think so, no. There were certain things in almost every photo, side-by-side comparison, that I saw differences of, which allowed me to determine which was which. One of them, there were some leaves on the ground in the foreground that were just ever so slightly out of focus, but I could see them better in one than the other, which told me that it was the R5.
That's
Um,
interesting.
the other thing
And
about that video, though, that gets me is that he was trying to compare, saying, hey, can you tell the difference? But also, he's shooting an EOS R, which is a very good camera. It's on par or better than the 5D Mark IV, with an L series lens, comparing it to an R5, which is an amazing camera, for 3 times the money, it better be, but also with another L series lens, that's built for
the system.
that's built for the RF. It's the RF mount built for the mirrorless cameras.
And that would have been interesting to see both the comparisons of the R and R5 with the same lens on it.
Certainly. I think that would have potentially created better value.
But I like this one though because it was a setup that was, you could buy the R with the adapter and a 16 to 35 f4, and you could probably find all those things used, maybe except for the adapter might be a little bit harder. But that is a pretty affordable setup that you can buy right there compared to the R5 and the 15 to 35, which are pretty hard to find used or, at a cheaper price.
Sure. Well, and that's true. If you're talking about, if we do some quick retail math, the R is $1,600. You can probably pick that lens up used pretty easily for $800 or $900, I would imagine. The adapters are $100, so you're at $2,700 compared to the other setup where that one lens retails for $2,300, and then the camera is another $3,900 on top of that. And it does make that good point. I'm just not sure if, or maybe I don't see a lot of value in that, because you're still talking about two relatively high-end cameras.
Yeah, well, but I think the thing is, though, what the video really shows, you were able to tell the differences, but most people cannot tell the differences, though, generally speaking.
That's true.
Between the photos, video might be a different story. Well, I'm sure it for sure would be a different story, but for landscape stuff, which is kind of what this was comparing, and probably most stuff, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And so both pro setups, but you can save a ton of money and get one setup compared to getting the other setup. I think that's really when it's most important is, do you need the best of the best? Is when you can still get a professional setup. I'm not saying you need to get a Rebel, something not worth anything, but you can get an R, which is still a great camera and a lot cheaper of a lens and stuff like that, and still get almost equal results. And so I think that's the debate, I think, is why spend the more money and get the R5.
Sure. That's fair. And there's definitely an exponential cost slider that escalates egregiously in price for just a tiny little bit more capable camera. And the difference maybe would be that if it wasn't ideal situation, because I really felt like that video was, during the middle of a cloudy day, you didn't have to deal with harsh shadows or have that need for better dynamic range that you may get out of the more expensive setup, or as it gets darker and you need higher ISO to make that photo work. But yeah, 90% of the time or better, I think you can go out with an R and an EF mount L series lens on an adapter and get phenomenal results. I mean, these cameras are brand new. You compare them to digital cameras from 15 years ago, and everything that they're making now is absolutely phenomenal, relatively speaking, compared to that, for about the same dollar figure that you were paying
back
then. And people were creating amazing, high quality stuff with that gear. The need for
the best of
the best is very minimal or quite rare, but also and maybe I'm trying to justify the money that I spend
Me
on the
too.
high end gear with there are some scenarios that you just aren't going to get the results that the highest end stuff is going to get. And my
But
mind goes to like professional sports games or something. You're going to have a harder time focusing on the guy running down the field with the R compared to with the R5 because you have, eye, head, face, helmet, person tracking
and
capabilities.
you're going, what is it, the R5 or 6 frames per second compared to 20
Yeah,
something or
compared
how?
to 20, yeah, you're definitely going to secure better results.
I think that's a different story though, because sports photographers, most of the time the gear isn't their own. Well, sometimes it is, but sports photographers, they justify every time there's the best thing comes out, they buy it right then. So, and I think that's a little bit different than maybe what we do, being kind of portrait, landscape, product stuff. But what I don't like, even though I this happens to me, is when a new camera comes out, then you're like, oh, suddenly my camera sucks. Even though the same thing happened, however many years ago when your camera came out. And so that's the thing is like, oh, the Sony A1 came out, and that's kind of how I was like, oh, I need it, and then it's like, oh, suddenly my camera is not good enough, and it really took me some internal thinking and praying to the almighties to realize that I don't need the A1, even though I very much will like to have it, but that I don't need it. And realistically, it's not going to make my images any better.
Sure. And I've,
It might make them marginally better, but probably not for the most part. My video, I would have more capability with my video, and that's actually the one thing is I think it's different when a new thing comes out and then you're just like, oh, I have to have this because it's new and shiny and it's the best thing on the market.
sure.
Whether you're waiting for something, you're like, oh, I wish my camera could do this. Ever since I had my A7R2, my first Sony, I was like, I want 4K 60. And that's what I've been waiting for. And then the R3 came out, didn't have it. The R4 came out, didn't have it, which I know it's, photo specialty camera, not really video as much, but it still didn't have it. Now all these other cameras are finally coming out with 4K 60 or 4K 120, and I'm like, okay, that's something I need, even though I still don't have it yet. But so I think that's more justifiable.
Sure. And I went through the same thing to a certain extent with Canon's announcement with the R3, which is an amazingly capable camera and does absolutely phenomenal things. But when it comes down to it, none of those things that it does are things that I would use probably ever.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't fill a void that I have, which is strange for me to say
Yeah. And
to
that
myself because I am, I definitely have some gear acquisition syndrome.
yeah, me too for
And,
sure.
I upgraded from the R to the R5 because it was there.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really anything that the R couldn't do that I needed it to do. And in that case, hopefully my wife's not listening, there wasn't like justification
Yeah.
to buy the R5, but here I am.
Here you are with it, right a foot from you.
Yep, sitting right next to me.
Yeah, and I think that's when really it comes down to is gear's just fun to have and to buy. But that's kind of I was the same way how you were with the R3. That's kind of how I was with the A1. Is I was like, hey, this has all these amazing things, but I'm paying for a lot of stuff that I don't need though. Being again a primarily landscape and commercial photographer, I don't need a lot of the things, and so I'm like, yes, I would like 4K 60, but I could get the A7 IV now that has 4K 60 for how much is it? $2,500 or something like that. Instead of trying to sell my A7 R4 and
And a
still
kidney.
and a kidney and sell myself to slavery to get the A1 when I can have 2 cameras, which would be even better because I've been wanting a second body forever, and it would still be cheaper to me. And it does everything I need it to do and more. So my next question is, when do you know that you've outgrown gear? And so when do you know that it is time to move on? Because maybe I had the R3 or you had the R, and we for sure did not outgrow it. Those cameras are both amazing, and we didn't need to get our next cameras. But when do you know that you've outgrown gear?
That's a tough one, and it's a tough one for me to answer because
Because you haven't dealt
have
with it yet.
I have a tendency to get the next thing before I outgrow my gear, and maybe that's something for me to work on in myself, is improving my skill set to the point where
You are
my
outgrowing
camera
the gear.
is no longer capable of doing what I want to be able to do. And
Yeah.
so when that new camera comes, I have real justification for making that purchase
Yeah.
in order to do what I want to do.
It's hard now because the cameras we have are just so amazing. I think we could spend our entire life with them and we would not outgrow them. I think they would be adequate. But I think when this really applies is when you're starting out in photography with your, like last episode, which was the pilot where we kind of introduced ourselves. By the way, go watch it if you haven't already. You talked about your first camera. What did you say it was again that you took with you to your mission?
The camera that I took with me on my mission was just a point and shoot film
Exactly.
camera.
And you start somewhere. And so when did you know that you outgrew that and you bought something else?
So I felt like I outgrew my camera because I was getting compliments from my dad as well as other people that dabble in photography. I was sending pictures home and they said, "Wow, this is really great." They really liked what I was doing, but I really felt limited on what I could do with that camera because basically I could zoom in and out and press the shutter release. I didn't have any real creative control over what I was doing, and maybe didn't really have, well, not maybe, I definitely didn't have the knowledge or understanding of things like how aperture worked and whatnot. Most of the stuff that I was sending home getting compliments about was things that I had, set up certain compositions and whatnot.
And with those really basic cameras, that's all you can do is just composition, and that's it.
For sure. And I guess in that sense, what it came down to was that for me wanting to move into more creative options, that camera didn't have the capability of doing those things. Primarily, it didn't have wide aperture capabilities. And that ultimately is what led me to buying the Olympus SLR that I bought, because it had a 50 millimeter f1.8 lens on it.
Which, by the way, even 1.8 to Andy is not sufficient. He has the 50 1.2 and the 85 1.2, and I actually think it's starting to go through his head. He's like, why have they not made something shallower? So
well, and they have.
And they have the Nikon 58 millimeter 0.95 that's manual focus and $9,000 or whatever.
Some ridiculous thing. Well, and Canon built a lens like that 20 something years ago. I think they built a 50 f.9.
Oh yeah,
0.95, and it wasn't the most beautiful thing. It's pretty rare. They're hard to get your hands on. They're worth a lot of money because they're rare, not because they're amazing. But
they're not that good.
Yeah.
At 0.95, just everything is soft, by the way. It's just, is there any sharpness to it?
Certainly. There's nothing sharp about it. It's more a brag from a camera company to say, look at how much light we can suck in with this enormous bulbous lens.
I think that's why Nikon made that lens, is just to say that they can do it.
That lens, that 0.95 is mostly just a flex.
Oh yeah, just to say you can do something. That's why
Yeah,
you put a ridiculous price tag on it too, so no one actually buys it. They probably
right.
just made one for the commercial and that's it.
Pretty much. But there's definitely, for me, a difference in what the new camera was capable of doing, because I had that f1.8 aperture. I was able to create that shallow depth of field. I was able to shoot later into the day or earlier in the morning and have enough light to make pictures work because of that. And so that was really the first time, and maybe the only time, that I had outgrown the gear that I had and needed something better.
And there is the saying that ignorance is bliss, and so a lot of the time, I guess you could say, is we're completely content with our gear, and I think that's actually good. If we're content with our gear, I actually think that's perfect. But then when we get something new or whatever, there's capabilities that we didn't even think about, doing, that now suddenly we have, whether it's, image stabilization or some crazy video or focusing or eye autofocus. Whoever thought that was going to be a thing, and now that we have it, it's this awesome thing though.
Definitely. I think that the danger, maybe, that comes with being complacent with your gear is becoming, or not complacent, but that your gear is just fine for what you do, is also maybe an excuse, I don't know, to not improve yourself to the point where you are capable of outperforming your gear. And I guess it depends on your motivation. If you want to get better, then you work on getting better, and you can either do that until you outgrow your gear and get new gear, or you can get new gear so that you can improve to the level of the capability of your gear.
Yeah.
I probably fall into that latter category because I get cameras that I don't necessarily need, but then they do cool stuff.
And you
Um,
learn how to do those cool things.
and lenses certainly the same way.
What's one piece of gear that's been the biggest effect to your photography, that's changed it the most? That's for the better, of course.
So I was shooting 8 or 9 years ago when Canon came out with the T4i. I upgraded from the T3i to the T4i because I wanted the autofocus during video capabilities that it had. It wasn't great, and I didn't really do video, so maybe that's where my gear acquisition syndrome started. But I was shooting with that camera, and the 18 to 135 kit lens that came with it was certainly a better kit lens, and I enjoyed the range that I got with that. But I came into some money, and I went down and bought the 70 to 200 f2.8 L series white Canon lens.
Oh
And
wow.
man, I couldn't believe the difference between the kit lens that I thought was great and that L series lens that is just absolutely phenomenal. That lens is kind of Canon's benchmark for perfection, so to speak, and has been for a long time, and they've improved it. And then the new RF mount version sitting here next to me is just absolutely, heads and shoulders better than, that's probably the wrong term, isn't it? Um,
I'm not sure. I've never heard that term, I guess, but you could use it.
um, just absolutely
Head over heels. That's
head over
everything.
heels. I don't know. Whatever the phrase is, the newest version of that lens for the mirrorless cameras is just absolutely phenomenal in what it's capable of doing. And I spent a month easy with that lens on that camera before I switched back and realized this is terrible. And that's when I really it really opened up my eyes what I was capable of creating with the right gear. And it's that L glass that Canon does that has kind of got me hooked at this point. Oliver's well aware of my addiction to
Yeah, that's for sure.
to those to the L series
The red
lenses,
ring.
but they're just so sharp and they focused so fast that it really opened up the opportunity for me to be able to do things that I just couldn't really do with the lens that I had. So in a lot of ways, lenses have made a bigger impact on me than camera bodies.
Yeah. So would you say what's better then? Have spend your money on a expensive, super nice camera and have mediocre lenses, or have a cheaper camera maybe and have nicer lenses?
Absolutely a cheaper camera with nicer lenses. Somebody said something that recently that I thought was kind of profound, and it was you date your camera, but you marry your lenses.
Yeah.
And, even with that Rebel T4i, what I was able to do with the L series glass on that Rebel camera was just leaps and bounds. That's the term, leaps and
There you
bounds,
go.
better than what I could do with that T4i and the kit lens that came with it, because the lens was so much more capable. And I kept that lens through 3 or 4 or 5 different camera bodies and only sold it so that I could get the new RF mount that mounts natively to my mirrorless cameras. And then, of course, it's 8 years newer, and
Yeah.
new R&D and whatever
Yeah,
makes it absolutely phenomenal lens.
that's for sure. Lenses you can have forever and they're great quality. That's one of the lenses that I use for almost all my commercial stuff is a Nikon 55 millimeter micro, which is just a macro lens, like a f3.5, which was actually my grandpa's, who was a photographer who I never knew, but it was his lens that he used on his Nikon f2. But I still use it for almost all of my commercial stuff, or at least my tabletop commercial stuff, and it's crazy sharp, and it's crazy old, and it just shows you that lenses really do last forever. By the way, I'm adapting this lens on my Sony, and that's same with I have my 55 millimeter Zeiss. I've had that for probably 5 years now. Right when I got my A7R2, that was the first lens I bought for it, and it's still probably my sharpest lens. So again, cameras, you have them for a few years and then you get a new one, and so for sure more important to spend your money on glass.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've certainly upgraded lenses, maybe unnecessarily.
Well, and you do have a new system now too, so you have the RF system, so the EF, and it's nice not to have a adapter, and the lenses are smaller and sharper, but it's just nice to have native lenses too.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of macro, I just recently bought Canon's 100 millimeter 2.8L macro RF mount from Allen's Camera. You should check that store out. It's pretty awesome. allenscamera.net if you're not a local Salt Lake or Utah person. Shameless plug. um, and it's really neat that it has an additional feature that allows you to control the spherical aberration. And so you can take spots of light and turn them into circles. But what I did notice with it when I was playing with it yesterday was that when you move to one end or the other of that, it starts to soften the sharp parts of
I thought it was just
your
the
image.
bokeh.
And that's the idea, is for it to affect the bokeh. But I think that, or what I saw, is that it affects the sharpness of the lens overall. You're softening everything, which gets exaggerated in the bokeh, but definitely
Yeah.
has effect on the sharpness. And so honestly, it's a feature that I probably won't use.
Yeah, I guess you could use it to get kind of a dreamy effect if you wanted to, but
Definitely. But I didn't necessarily need to move to the newest lens because I had the EF version of it and it was just great. And I don't do a lot of macro work, but that's interesting. I didn't know, Oliver, that you use that older Nikon
yeah, and
macro lens.
I'll have to show you some of the pictures I've taken on it, and it's you wouldn't guess that it was a old lens. And I have 3 or 4 of the lenses actually. And I was gonna sell them, but I'm gonna hold on to them, forever. They have an insane amount of focus breathing, which isn't fun for commercial stuff, but they're really sharp though. So it's pretty surprising how sharp they are, and they have beautiful color too. Like the colors, not like anything you see on newer lenses. And so, but yeah, it's a great lens. So, what gear, if I was just starting out in photography, what gear should I spend my money on first? Assuming I already have a camera and lens, I got the Costco package for $400 or $500 with my Canon Rebel T6 and my 2 kit lenses.
Uh, if that's the case, the first thing that I think that really the first thing I think anyone should buy is a 50 millimeter f1.8. They're super inexpensive. Nikon's is $200. Canon's is like $126, something like that. I don't know what Sony's is.
Sony's is a little bit more expensive and it's a lot more crappy. Well, it's sharp. It sounds like a transformer when it's focusing. So if you do that, get the Rokinon or one of the off brands, or Sigma or something, and they'll be better and still cheap.
But I think that having the opportunity for that very shallow depth of field, the very nice bokeh that you get from that, I think that opens up a whole new world of capabilities
For sure.
for very little money.
Yeah. And I almost think if I were to recommend someone buying stuff now, I would just recommend buy the camera body and buy that lens. Don't worry about the kit lenses. Buy that lens. Kit lenses they're just not, they're fine, and that's about it. They're just fine. And that was, I had my Rebel T3 with the 18 to the old version of the 18 to 55, and then like the 75 to 300. I sold that, and I got the T6S with the 55 to 250 and the 18 to 135 or something like that. And so I was super excited about it. And the camera was actually like a pretty capable camera. Like it had pretty good focusing and everything. It was 24 megapixels or whatever. And I went on a cruise and took a bunch of shots that I thought were amazing. And then I remember getting home and just being like, these pictures are just not sharp. They don't have a punch to them. They don't have great contrast or anything. And that's when shortly after I bought my Sony and just the 55 millimeter 1.8, that's all I had. Well, and a Rokinon 14 millimeter that was for Canon. But that's when I realized that lenses are just crazy important. And they don't have to be expensive. You can get that little 50 millimeter and it will be crazy sharp, but it'll just improve your photography by a ton. And the nice thing about those two is when you get a 50 millimeter is it's really making you think too, as you're thinking about your composition and you're thinking about your exposure and everything way more than whether you just have some kit lenses.
For sure. And in addition to that, it's also gives you the opportunity to consider what you want in focus in your frame.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't all have to be in focus, where with those kit lenses, because the aperture is relatively small, you're mostly going to have everything in focus, and it's tough to draw attention to your subject when that's the case. Those kit lenses give you the opportunity to shoot really wide to really narrow, when you have the 18 to 55 and the 55 to 250 or 75 to 300 that they throw into those kits.
And that's just the problem too, is I don't think a beginner person should have, if you are doing photography as a hobby and you will never get out of automatic, then it's fine to have those kit lenses. but I think those kit lenses stunt your growth as a photographer a ton because you don't know what you like to shoot, you don't know how to use your lenses good and everything. And so giving, a beginner photographer all the way from 18 to 300 millimeters is just on a crop sensor, which is crazy, is just way too much.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and it's about your intentions or your motivations. If you want to take pictures of your kids playing soccer at the park, then that's great. But if you're wanting to create, I like to use the term, if you want to create images as opposed to take pictures, then moving into those lenses that are more capable, and and like we say, you don't have to spend $2,300 on the f1.2 version of the 50 millimeter lens. You can buy the 51.8. It's $135 after tax if you have sales tax, and it's really one stop difference. There's not a huge difference in light and capabilities between those two lenses, one of which being 20 times as much money. It's a little
Yeah.
bit crazy.
Yeah, for sure. So what other items would you recommend? Well, maybe some accessories. What do you think you need as a photographer? Because I think it's starting out as a photographer. I think it's easy to get into buying a bunch of unnecessary accessories and stuff like that. Maybe weird bags you don't need or something. So what do you think are the more important ones that you need? Just the necessary ones, I would say.
As a salesman, it's really hard for me to narrow that
As a
down.
salesman, everything.
um,
4 batteries, 2 bags,
yeah,
6
all
SD
the
cards.
filters. No, I really think that having an extra battery is always a good idea,
Extra battery, extra memory card,
and a decent tripod.
decent tripod. I think that is one time where gear does matter, is on a tripod.
Definitely.
You will see photographers that buy nice everything and then they want to go cheap on their tripod. And I've done that. I think we've all done it. And the tripods just don't last. Even I've bought some nicer ones where they're, a few $100 or something like that, or a couple $100, and they just don't last like the really nice ones do. And so I think that's actually very important. If you're an avid tripod user, not all photographers will be. If you're a portrait photographer, you're not going to use a tripod very much. But, being a landscape or real estate or commercial photographer, you're going to use a tripod a decent amount. And so buy a good tripod.
Definitely.
Save your money by buying nice once and not buying 5 different tripods, and you'll still end up buying the nice one eventually, but better to do it now
For
than
sure.
later.
I have people, I won't say constantly, but very often people come in, they're holding a $3,000 camera with a $2,000 lens, and they want to buy the $40 tripod. And, I'm not going to stop you from buying what you want to buy. I'll advise against it with all the passion I can muster, because the idea of putting, $5,000 worth of equipment on a $40 tripod kind of makes me sick
Yeah, and
in the stomach.
if you're wanting a cheaper tripod, find a old used one. It'll be heavier, yeah, but it will, if it's a nice brand like Gitzo or something like that, they'll last though.
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of options when it comes to tripods, and I don't want to get into a sales pitch necessarily, but the things to factor is if you're going to be hiking with it or not. A lightweight tripod is certainly going to give you some value, and then you're not lugging around a big heavy tripod.
Yeah.
In that case, going with the carbon fiber option may have some real value if you do that sort of thing. Whereas if you know that you're going to go to Yellowstone and you're going to drive by, pull over when you see a buffalo and lean out your window and take a picture, then there's not a good reason to spend good money on a good tripod or on a lightweight tripod. I have a couple of different tripods. one of which is very light for if I'm going to go hiking. The other one that I have is a very big, heavy, solid tripod. It's got like big feet.
Oh yeah, that is
it.
a pretty cool tripod.
And it's a super cool tripod, but I'll tell you what, I wouldn't want to hike more than 100 yards with it.
Yeah.
Because it's just absolutely a beast. But I think that those are probably the things that are important to maybe right off the bat invest a little bit more into. You invest better into your lenses than into your body. I think investing in a good solid tripod, if that's going to be a piece of gear that's you're likely to use, like Oliver was saying, if you're going to do portraits, then the tripod is next to useless and there's not a good need for it. But if you're going to do landscapes or wildlife or video stuff, having a good tripod is absolutely critical.
Yeah. So, other than, the essentials, I actually think one of the most important thing you can spend your money on is classes or tutorials, kind of, or even, software stuff like Photoshop or stuff like that. It's the non-obvious things, which usually aren't as fun to spend your money on, but those usually end up being the most helpful. Tutorials or classes, you teach a bunch of classes.
I do.
And those can improve your photography a million more times than any camera will. From my time studying and getting my photography degree, that expounded my photography so much. I feel like I learned so much about lighting and composition and everything. And it was expensive. It wasn't terribly expensive. It was, $2,200 a semester, but worth every penny. I'd much rather have used that money on school than I would have on gear. And you don't necessarily need to go to a university to do that. You can do workshops or classes from someone or download tutorials. But it's knowledge that can be pretty difficult to find out yourself sometimes if you're just trying to figure it out yourself.
For sure. And that's part of really what got me into teaching, was because trying to find information that is tailorable to you so that you can understand it can be really difficult. I have people all the time on Facebook forums and groups and all of that. Oh, YouTube videos. And there certainly can be some value to those.
YouTube videos are great, but they usually only get you so far.
The feedback that I get from people that I teach when they do go and watch those videos is that if there's something they don't understand, then that's too bad.
Then they search for another video on it.
Yeah, and then you got to search for another video, and you can rabbit hole yourself so bad. Whereas with a live class, like when I teach private classes one-on-one, or, if you want your spouse to join you, then that's fine. But if you have a question, then you can just stop me and ask. Or if you don't understand what I'm saying, it's quick and easy to say, hey, that doesn't make sense. And I can find a different way to explain that sort of thing. And I really feel like that's where a lot of good value comes from, is learning from a person that you can interact with in order to ensure that you understand what's going on, or what they're talking about before you move forward. And then you get lost and frustrated and you don't want to do it anymore because you're not learning anything. And that's kind of my piece on it. And there's certainly value in school. In fact, Oliver and I were talking about me taking some of those same courses that he took. I'm at a point in my life where education is not real, as far as formal education goes, is not really an important thing necessarily. Although the value of taking those courses would definitely benefit me.
Yeah.
There's no doubt.
And there's workshops, and there's a million different ways to do it, but the information is super helpful. Like, if you don't mind saying, how much do you charge for your classes?
So I charge $50 an hour to teach my classes.
Which is, by the way, maybe if you're starting out, that might sound expensive, but that is a steal. That is an amazing deal. Like going back from it, I kind of, I had some photography classes at high school, but if I wouldn't have had those, I for sure would have done classes like that, especially for that price. If you can do $50 an hour to learn photography one on one from a professional, that's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for that. I really feel like I can offer a lot of value for less money because I don't need to charge a fortune, and it allows me to share photography with other people, which I really love doing. And I've had a couple of people who have taken classes from me and gone on to, shoot professionally. And, there's a lady that I know that took a class from me, and she ended up getting hired by a whale watching group and to photograph whales so they can document
That's
migration
awesome.
patterns and that sort of thing. And she just absolutely loves what she's able to do. And I feel like I can claim a little piece of that because I got her started and to a place where she understood what her camera could do, and how to make the camera do that. And then she's, taken off and living her dream of being a photographer.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's really what I think is important is instead of spending all this money on gear, which you can spend, it's still good to spend money on gear, do some education, and it's still not crazy expensive, and it will get your photography way better.
Yeah, you definitely have the opportunity to outgrow your gear.
Yeah. And that,
Uh,
that that's my next question. Can you be a terrible photographer and have amazing gear, and vice versa? Can you have crappy gear and be an amazing photographer?
yes, and yes. I had an experience where I was with my daughter. I was teaching her photography. She was probably 10 or 11. And we were up in an area near downtown Salt Lake. I was watching a woman photograph another woman in her wedding dress, and I could see that the bride was frustrated, and I could see that the photographer was really kind of out of ideas and didn't really know what to do from there. And she had nicer gear than I had, and and so I get all jealous about it, whatever. But I just kind of sat back and I was trying to teach stuff to my daughter while I was kind of getting frustrated watching this poor bride get frustrated. And finally the photographer went over to use a public restroom, and I ran over to the bride, and I had taken a couple of shots from far off of the bride and said, "Hey, I can see you're frustrated. I just want you to know that there's a better opportunity or a better option here. In fact, let me just show you a picture I took of you, and I'll get them to you, or I'll delete them." And I don't mean to be
Photographer
a
probably
creep.
hated
I know.
you.
And she saw the images that I was able to create without even having to direct her as to what to do. And she's like, "Oh my gosh, this is so frustrating. I'm standing here in my wedding dress and I have no idea what I'm doing. And I feel like my photographer doesn't either." And I said, "Well, when she comes out, tell her you're sick. Go sit in your car. When she drives away, let's do some pictures." And she says, "Well, I can't afford you." And I said, "No, no, no, this one's on me." And we spent maybe 20 minutes after the other photographer left. And I ended up sending her 12 or 14 really neat images, really great stuff. As far as I was concerned, I really liked them. She messaged me back when she got them that she absolutely loved them and was so grateful that I was there and was able to kind of rescue that situation. But it was a perfect example of, somebody who wanted to be a photographer, and they went down to the store and dropped $4,000 on some really nice gear, but without a background or an education or any experience, went out and kind of ruined somebody's day.
Yeah. And you need to start somewhere, but for sure not. You need to know your limits though, and not take on jobs. Well, I think yes, you can take on jobs that are bigger than you, but knowing that you can still come out with results, though.
For sure. And I don't want to gripe about her dropping $4,000 on gear and not knowing what she's doing, because if you have the budget to spend $4,000, by all means, come to my store, spend $4,000. I'm happy with that.
And that was Alan's all the time. Is I'd see people come in with crappy systems or really cheap systems with amazing stuff, or even stuff on 35 millimeter film, a $100 camera. And then I'd see people with amazing gear and crappy photos.
Yeah, definitely. I know a couple of guys that shoot almost exclusively on film, and they make some pretty amazing stuff because they understand what film can do. And, they created stuff that I tried to recreate and couldn't do with film because I don't have necessarily that same skill set that they had with, when it comes to film photography. But you can absolutely be an amazing photographer with cheap gear.
Yeah.
And you can absolutely go out and spend a fortune and not be able to utilize what you have and come out with some, pretty muddy results.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time now, but kind of what I wanted to leave this with is that more than anything, you limit yourself, not your gear. Your gear does to an extent, but more than anything, you and your knowledge, you limit yourself. So, Andy, I'm going to ask you again. Does camera gear actually matter?
No.
But kind of.
I really think that if you know what you're doing, you can take any current model camera and create phenomenal stuff.
Yeah. And that's everything that is out now within the last 5 years is amazing for the most part.
For sure.
Okay. So that's where we're going to leave it. So stay tuned next week where we're going to talk more about film. Right, Andy?
That's right. Look forward to that.
Okay. And again, let us know if you have any questions or if you want us to cover anything. Have a good evening.